Now, much more importantly, it is my delight to introduce Megan Briers, who's from the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, and today she will be speaking to us on Greenwich as a home and observatory, the Airy family and the RGO connections. Take it away, Meg.
Thank you, Bridget. And I just want to start my presentation by saying thank you both to the organisers of this mini workshop in the conference and the whole workshop. I've been very lucky to be here for 4 months, and I feel so incredibly grateful for the opportunities. I just thought I'd start by expressing my gratitude. So what exactly have I been doing with my time here is a question I will definitely have to answer when I get back to my home institute. So I just want to start with a little example, a walkthrough of a typical Saturday for me, because to my great joy, the archives are open on Saturday here. So I'm doing my PhD in Berlin, but I'm studying British history. So being offered 4 months in Cambridge was a perfect opportunity for me to get through the bulk of my archive research. And again, lucky for me, 15 minutes down the road here is the Cambridge University Library. And in the library are all of the papers of the Royal Observatory Greenwich. They moved there when the observatory officially closed in the 1990s, and in that archive collection there are papers ranging from the foundation of the observatory in 1675 up until the papers of the last director in the 1990s. So I'm focused on 19th century expeditions, so I spend a lot of my time in RGO 6, the papers that cover the period where George Biddle Airy was the Astronomer Royal. And while I do want to add a little bit of nuance to his character today, George was governed by some form of sense of order. He stored a lot of papers and correspondence that are in this RGO 6 collections now, and his son commented that as he aged, it was really something he clung on to. Towards the end of his life, he was more concerned, his son says, with ordering and arranging the correspondence he get, even as he was losing grasp on the actual content of the correspondence. So a typical experience when you're in the RGO archives is you'll call up one specific call number, say RGO 6113, papers on longitudes and solar eclipses, for example. It may be stored in a bound volume, which is this one on the bottom, if you're lucky, and if you're not, it's going to be stored in like a deconstructed bound volume, which is lots of these little grey papers, so you get very good at learning how to tie back up those folders when you're done with them. And within each call number, when you open the box, there tends to be this kind of list at the start, and probably quite illegible. This is an index written by George himself, so it kind of tells you roughly what order of the papers you're going to come to see within that collection. You need to take these with a bit of grain of salt, because he's got a very good tendency to forget to mention that his family are going to have papers in any of these lists, but you can kind of follow through and you get eventually to papers, correspondence, maps, photos, a variety of material within the archive. So there was a recent paper that came out in the March version of ISIS that laid out how George had kind of built up this system of organisation for the materials at Greenwich. And Yuto Ishibashi, the author, argued two main things about the organisational collections. Firstly, that George used his kind of organisational methods with the archives to reform the working practice at Greenwich, making it efficient and organised to let the observatory business run smoothly. And secondly, Ishibashi also argued that he used the collections to bolster the observatory's authority and institutional identity. And that was really especially quite important in the 19th century, because the practices and the very space of Greenwich were far from settled. So how does this relate to my PhD project? So I'm studying women's involvement in 19th century astronomy expeditions, things like solar eclipse expeditions or the 2 transits of Venus. There were lots of women in these expeditions, but their voices tend to be harder to find. And this is partially related to the kind of definition and idea of an archive. Archives, as they were understood in 19th century Europe, were foundations of national identity. And the RGO collections at the Cambridge University Library are very much archives in these traditional senses. Ishibashi highlighted in his article how George tried to project backwards a sense of historical continuity between the work that he was doing at Greenwich with Greenwich's very foundational ideas to try and kind of maintain the importance and stability of Greenwich. So with this definition, and given that I mostly work with 19th century European archives of institutions like Greenwich or learned societies, it's easy to see how archives privilege certain voices, spaces, and stories. And that can't really be unlinked from questions of power along a variety of axes. Critically, many of the archives that I work with were not created by people that considered women as active historical agents. And I don't want to claim this is a statement that is exclusively true for women in this period, or that gender is the only analytic to pay attention to here, but it's just the one I will be paying attention to today, not any sort of final or privileged view. So how do we work with trying to make women as historical actors with these archives? So there's a variety of ways championed by historians of gender and women over the past couple of decades. Working with the archives themselves, this could involve really close reading practices or trying to read against the grain, finding material in the archive that doesn't necessarily reflect the order and the ambitions of the people that created these collections. But also people have called for a broader definition of what we consider historical source material. Really good examples of this from the last few years, including working with glass plates to locate the work of women computers at observatories, or things like reading trade cards to find women involved in the scientific instrument trade. A more meta approach, which I will be taking on in this presentation, is to look at the archives as objects of study in themselves. Because it's been noted that through both our reliance on archives as a key disciplinary practice of our profession and the actual content of the archives themselves, history is an active agent in constituting the ideas of gender, science, and mathematics, among other concepts. And recent studies have showed the fruitfulness of taking archives seriously as an object of study in themselves. Because as Lydia Barnett demonstrated in her study of 18th century European naturalists, the records and traces of labouring fossil suppliers in the archives speak, quote, more directly to the cultural values, practices, and beliefs of elite naturalists responsible for creating them than they do to the marginalised labourers whose life they faintly record. So Ishibashi's study was great. It focused on what made the cut in the RGO collections and how these systems were created. But he concluded his piece by suggesting it might be useful to look at the emissions and the criteria for what had been selected to be preserved within the RGO collections. So considering this and what other historians have shown about the benefits of taking an archival turn, it's my intention in this presentation to more critically analyse what has made its way into the RGO collections and show how concepts of gender, observatory, and domesticity guided the creation of the RGO collections, and highlighting the potential implications this has on historical work that relies on the RGO collections for their main sources. The problem is like a matter of size, because the archives from just George's period cover or span the length of 110 metres, which is the length of a traditional international football pitch. So how do I make this a kind of manageable study? So as George was Ishibashi's main historical actor, I'd like to introduce you to mine, which is, Richarda Airy, which is George's wife. So a bit about Richarda. She was the daughter of Charlotte Smith and the Reverend Richard Smith, who was a chaplain to the 6th Duke of Devonshire. The Devonshires are the family that own Chatsworth. So the Smith family grew up in Windsor, pictured on the right here. Richarda and George met in 1824. George fell instantly in love, but Richarda's father initially denied the match until George had a greater financial standing. George spent the next couple of years working his way up the ranks in Cambridge, and the match was eventually approved when he became Plumian Professor of Astronomy and Experimental Physics at Cambridge. So initially I just had these kind of facts on the slide, and then I realised I didn't want a slide just of information about how she was related to George. So a few things about her as a person. She was a very keen artist. She made a lot of sketches of landscapes and the environments that she lived in, such as Greenwich. And also letter writing seems to be a favourite pastime, because she corresponded with many figures, including Margaret Herschel, Maria Mitchell, William Whewell, and Augustus de Morgan, to name just a few. And as I'll demonstrate across this presentation, She was involved in a range of scientific practices for her own enjoyment and for the betterment of George's career. So, what are my research questions for this presentation? For the first part of my presentation, Richarda's papers and the relationship to the RGO collections will be my main object of focus. Papers of hers exist within the RGO collections. How and why did they get here? What were the motivations behind these acts of preservation? And on a more historical point, what can they tell us about Richarda and her life? And then through this analysis is how I'll be able to take on my second, slightly more ambitious research aim, which is to learn what the implications are of preservation policies for the RGO collections for historians that rely on this material. We know that George was trying to create and defend a very specific image of the observatory, and I'll show that what was selected and preserved was also likewise related to quite specific understandings of gender, science, and domestic spaces. So there's going to be 4 main sections in the presentation. I'm going to jump forward in the timeline to look at the sorting of Richarda's papers after her death, to start with, and look at kind of the processes by which they might have ended up in the RGO collections. Secondly, I'll focus in on what exactly was the content of these letters, looking at some experiments to try and replicate red prominences that are seen in solar eclipses in 1851. I'll then zoom out and kind of give a broad overview of some of the other papers that ended up in the RGO collections to try and talk a bit more about the potential motivations. And then finally, I'll integrate some material that did not make it into the RGO collections and offer a new angle on the controversy of the discovery of Neptune, and argue that the involvement of women and domestic spaces in key episodes in the history of astronomy have kind of been obscured by the archive construction process. So, having just introduced Richarda, I'm going to jump us forward to the end of her life. So Richarda died on the 13th of August 1875. She'd suffered a stroke in 1870 and had been nursed at home by her 2 unmarried daughters, Christabel and Annette, for the remaining of her life. This is a spread of the Astronomer Royal's journal that covers the week in which she died. So the Astronomer Royal's journal is a source that has got a bit of slack for being quite dry, but it's actually really rich because George doesn't just record kind of observations or administrative work that he does, although that does contain the bulk of the material, but he also has personal notices in this journal, including things like the birth of his grandchildren, as we see in this case, the death of his wife, or his health, general records of his health. So George writes a short biography of Richarda on the day that she dies, adding to the journal later with a newspaper clipping of her that covers her funeral and a list of the 9 children that they had together. So just 3 days after her death, George's organisation begins, and he sets about organising her papers. He starts with her sketches, which is particularly fitting, giving almost the very day after they were married, Richarda was starting to be involved in producing sketches for George's lectures at Cambridge. And so, correspondingly, he starts on August 16th by looking at her sketchbooks and barely tending to the observatory, or scarcely tending to the observatory. So over the 3 months that followed her death, there's only a single week where there's not some reference to him sorting the material, namely the one that he was on holiday at the end of September. George organised not only Richarda's letters, but also the papers, artworks, and letters of their daughter, who he exclusively refers to as Dear Elizabeth, who had died of consumption at the age of 19 in 1852. So the organisation largely took place immediately after Richarda's death, in this initial period of very intense work. Between when he first consults her letters in August and the last reference in 1875, which is in November, George spends just under half of all of the days recorded in this journal at least partially employed in sorting through this material. In 1 week in October, he sorts through the material every single day, and shortly after this intense work, he comments that the heavy work of her papers has been cleared. A few weeks later, on November 15th, we get the last explicit reference to the sorting process in 1875, this rather anticlimactic entry that just notes Richarda's letters. But the next and final explicit reference to her papers appears out of the blue again in the following autumn, indicating that the sorting process likely continued over this kind of period, but perhaps was just conducted with a little bit of a less intense focus. So what was the point of sorting these papers? There are brief indications both in the journal and in the content of the papers that made it into the RGO collections about why he would want to sort through this material. Naturally, this was just going to be a task that family members undertook after the death of relatives, especially those with George's organisational tendencies. But there's also a mention on the August 21st that kind of might hint at some motivation, where he says he, quote, separated a few of Richard's collected letters. And, as I'll explore in the upcoming section, some of Richard's letters did make it into the RGO collections. It's likely that this transfer also had taken place at earlier points, just from what we know about the sorting processes of these collections, but it's clear that Richard's material was deemed necessary to move into the RGO collections, which George was constructing to defend the position and legacy of Greenwich. So at this point, it feels fitting to go back into the RGO collections and look exactly at what is saved. So, to start with, there are these two letters. Really, it's actually just kind of one letter and a slip that she adds later in the day, but they are under two different call numbers. And these cover some experiments undertaken in Edinburgh in 1851 to try and replicate red prominences that are typically seen in a solar eclipse. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of context on the red prominences and observing solar eclipses in the 19th century. So from about the 1830s, astronomers had begun observing solar eclipses, not with just the means to correct, or the motivation to correct lunar tables, but also to learn a bit more about the properties of the sun, the moon, and their atmospheres. And British observers first went out on an expedition in 1842, of which Richard took part in. And these expeditions continued across the century, especially picking up after successes in 1860. So in 1842, when they'd gone to observe the solar eclipses, they'd been really surprised to notice these little red prominences at the kind of edge of the sun. Really, really not visible in that one unless, I'm sorry. George himself was particularly excited about these. When he wrote up his instructions for observers in 1851, he really wanted the red prominences to be their main research focus. The big question at the time was their kind of questions about their origin, whether these belonged to the sun or to the moon, or whether they were actually just some form of optical illusion. So what are some disadvantages of having to wait for the solar eclipses to investigate these red prominences? The length of time between them. Solar eclipses do take place at relatively regular intervals, definitely compared to things like transits of Venus, but there's still often a wait of 1 or a couple more years between each eclipse. Secondly, weather. The British expeditions prided themselves on some form of controlling the controllables, and one thing that they definitely could not control was the weather. Many a time, their whole observation plan was ruined by the appearance of a single cloud. And secondly, and this is partially in their own words, the questionable observing ability, because they really struggled to kind of focus and not be overwhelmed by the amount of tasks that they had to do when they turned up and they had a couple of minutes to observe totality. So, what was the solution? They were quite interested in trying to replicate this ability to see red prominences without a solar eclipse. There were various ways of trying this, emphasis there on trying. These involved placing a small sphere on in front of the object glass on a telescope to try and eclipse the sun's images in a similar way to what the moon does. Another one, my favourite one from Piazzi Smythe, is placing a black screen on top of Carlton Hill in Edinburgh, the Carlton Monument, sorry, the Nelson's Monument, and just waiting for the sun to pass it and observing to see if the red prominences appeared there. But the experiments that Richard took part in used this contraption. And this is my vague understanding of the contraption. Basically, there was a tube at the end of the object end which carried a small disc which was meant to obscure some of the light, and you were already not meant to get very much light in because they kept a very small slit in the dome there at the top. And then also at the bottom, there was a glass tube with some form of black lining that also carried a bit of the light into there, and then you were able to see it at the top of the tube. I'm still trying to figure this whole contraption out because it didn't work, so they didn't really like talking about it very often. But what do Ricciarda's letters tell us about this experiment? So she does include a description of the method of the experiment and the motivation, writing this back to George to tell him about the experiment. George is not very complimentary about her description of the method, and initially I was disappointed with his opinions, but then I went and tried to reconstruct the experiment based on her description, and now I'm in complete agreement with George, is that they are not great descriptions of what actually happened there. She also includes diagrams of her observations and makes notes on each of these points about what these diagrams were meant to represent. And finally, she judges and makes statements about whether she thought the experiments were any good. She'd seen these red prominences in 1842, and she stated that the ones that she'd observed in Edinburgh when they tried to do this experiment in 1851 likely weren't the same red prominences that they'd first seen in 1842, and she thought this was kind of something to do with an optical effect of the telescope and that they were using. So, one of the many goals for the presentation is to what we can learn about Ricciarda through these papers. We learn that she's a very active member in the kind of networks and conversations that were happening around red prominences at the time. And I'll discuss in the next section that she'd observed these in 1842 and was clearly up to date with experiments and kind of investigations about them at the time. So that's the first case of Ricciarda's letters being preserved in the RGO collections. There are another few instances. As I've mentioned, she went on the 1842 expedition. So there are instructions of what exactly she had to observe when she was there, as well as handwritten observations from when she was there. The picture that I showed earlier that was really not visible of the red prominences from Airy's publication, there's also archive material to suggest that she was involved in creating this diagram. That was slightly hinted at by the fact that the diagram in his article was exactly representing what she'd been tasked to observe during the eclipse, but there's also an unsigned piece of paper which goes and gives her corrections to the copy that they'd initially got back from the printers. So why have these particular things been saved? A lot of Ricciarda's papers are there because they are the sole sources of the information that was necessarily required to maintain this kind of record of the work that was being done at Greenwich. And this is where Ishibashi's article is very, again, useful. There was multiple motivations guiding why they needed this archive, but accountability for the work that was being undertaken as a government institution was a large part of the drive for this archive, as well as needing to justify the research undertaken and rationalise the state of the observatory. Ricciarda's papers were necessary to save in this, whether George was particularly keen to admit her involvement in these processes in public or not. So, as we've already seen, from the time that it took for George to sort through Ricciarda's papers, what is in the RGO collections, which is not like everything I've just shown on the slide, I don't think is an exhaustive list, but I don't think there's going to be dramatically more. So what happened to the rest of the material? And as far as I can tell, the rest of Ricciarda's papers passed through various branches of the family. Some of the material was burnt. My least favourite of the Airy immediate family burnt the letters between Ricciarda and George after he'd finished writing George's autobiography. But gradually the family has donated various bundles of the surviving papers back to the Cambridge University Library, as demonstrated in these 4 additional folders, which are the call numbers for the family papers. They're outside of the RGO collections, but they are now accessible to readers at the library. And in my final part of the presentation, I'm going to use some of the materials from these folders to demonstrate the limitations of what we're going to be able to learn about Ricciarda and their family and the domestic spaces in the RGO collections. Focusing on the discovery of the Neptune controversy, I'll show how notions of observatory and domestic spaces as very distinct spheres influenced how the archive was constructed, and consequently how this has obscured women and domestic spaces as key agents in narratives built from the RGO collections. So in brief, the Neptune controversy. I'm just going to give a rough historical kind of overview of like the necessary context that we're going to need for the next section. So Neptune was observed in Berlin in late September 1846 by Johann Galle and Heinrich de Rest. They observed this because Urban Le Verrier had written to them and told them to look in that particular spot in the sky for the new planet. He'd predicted the planet to be there because of the misbehavior of Uranus. After these observations in Berlin were announced, there were a couple of people in British newspapers that started to argue that John Couch Adams, a young Cambridge mathematician, had actually also predicted Neptune's position and had been working on this problem before Le Verrier had started. So cut to lots of debate about who the true discoverer was and whether people had behaved in the correct way in this episode, which has arguably continued throughout the secondary literature surrounding this Neptune controversy. George, as in some way a guardian of British astronomy in this period, was in a particularly vulnerable spot, especially because he'd actually been in correspondence with both Le Verrier and Adams and knew that they were both working on this same problem. The list of various wrongdoings that George was accused of could go on for a while, could go on for another 45 minutes, but I'm going to focus on one particular problem point, and that is John Couch Adams' 3 attempted visits to Greenwich to discuss his research with George. So Adams had tried to call at Greenwich, depicted here in both these pictures, 3 times. Firstly, in September, late September in 1845, and then secondly, late October 1845, where he'd called twice in the same day. In any of these instances, he wasn't seen into Greenwich and didn't get to talk to George. Something important to note that hasn't come up so far is that the Airies lived on site. The observatory and the domestic buildings were all on the same site, and these pink buildings are the living quarters of the Astronomer Royal, also the ones relevant here in this lovely picture by Richarda's sister, Elizabeth Smith. So you can talk about some form of physical separation of these apartments to the rest of the observatory to an extent, but they really weren't that separate from observing and calculating spaces, the green one being an example here, and also on top of these 4 apartments is the octagon room, very much considered a working space of the observatory. But as I will show in the next kind of section, any kind of idea of physical separation does kind of disintegrate when you look at the practices of the people. So back to the Neptune controversy and this overly convoluted diagram. There's one letter in the RGO collections that is addressed to Richarda concerning the Neptune controversy, and it comes from Adam Sedgwick. It came in a kind of flurry, in a period of a lot of correspondence passing between Adam Sedgwick, a long family friend of the Airies and professor of geology here, and George and Richarda in December 1846. And they were discussing this kind of controversy about whether George had done the right things in relation to Adam's call. So I've created a very crude and overcomplicated diagram, I'm now noting, that includes the kind of timeline that plots their correspondence. The main point that I want to highlight here is that dotted arrows represent when someone is replying to a letter that was not directly addressed to them. So you'll see that both Richarda and George replied to letters that were addressed to the other one, indicating that this really was a correspondence between the 3 of them. Now the other key point in this diagram is that if they have a red border around the letters, and each of these boxes represent a letter, that means that they're stored in the RGO collections. And one thing you can note is that none of Richarda's replies are stored in the RGO collections. And we really only get to see this for the letter to Richarda in the middle because George directly replies to it as well. So, luckily, Richarda's replies are now accessible in Cambridge University Library because they've been deposited with the family collections. So, what did she write in these letters? So, she begins these letters that are now in the family collections by saying that she wasn't going to write a defense of George. His actions had kind of done that, and he'd done that in his letters and his publications himself. She does proceed to use the letters to write a fairly solid defense of George across the whole episode, but these counters that she spends most of the letters talking about how he'd actually done the right thing, while showing her kind of deep involvement and investment in the episode, are not the most interesting thing for me. What's more interesting is the emphasis that she places on family boundaries in guiding their actions during the episode. So part of what she uses the letters to do is to clarify the problems that people were having about the visits and the timing of the visits and whether George had deliberately not seen Adams when he called. So Richarda, but not George, had actually been in the house for all 3 of these occasions of Adams trying to call. So she could write a pretty strong defense about covering where George actually was. In September, that was pretty easy because George was not actually in the country. In October, in the morning, Richarda clarifies that George was in the country, but not at Greenwich at the time. She speculates where he could have been. Perhaps he was in London on work business, or perhaps he was on his daily walk, she emphasises, how this was, quote, absolutely necessary for his health. She comes back to personal practices and boundaries in reference to the afternoon episode. The Airies were at dinner when Adams had called in the afternoon. And as Richarda explained, they had established a rule never to let people in while they were eating dinner, even their friends. She emphasises this was absolutely necessary because otherwise he wouldn't get a meal in peace. Arguably, also the rest of their family wouldn't get a meal in peace. She goes on to highlight how incessant George's work was in this period, and it was not surprising that George wanted this time just to be alone and not to be disturbed by any distractions. George, in his own replies to Sedgwick, spends most of the time defending other actions in the episode, clarifying how he had tried to reach out to Adams after these calls, and it was completely out of line, as some people had been arguing, to expect George to have published the note that Adams left on the occasions of his visits. However, in some of the later letters, he does also admit the kind of existence of personal family circumstances that might have influenced his behaviour. As other historians have pointed out, Richarda was also heavily pregnant at this time. She would give birth to their 9th and final child just a few days after Adams' second set of attempted visits. And George, very reluctantly, does explicitly state this to Sedgwick, stating, "I was at the end of October 1845, busy almost every day at the Gouge Commission, and on October 27th, my boy Osmond was born. I ashamed to mention these things." When he's talking to Sedgwick, he also states that he wasn't annoyed about Sedgwick asking him all these questions. He goes on to say, they being the people who were accusing George of these actions in Cambridge, which was not Sedgwick, they have, by their low conduct, produced such a train of circumstances that you have been compelled to ask questions which no gentleman, if free, would ask, and which no gentleman could be expected to answer. So why was this such a problem for George to answer these questions? And why only in Richarda's letters do we see much more about how family and personal boundaries guided their actions in the episode? I want to contend this is because George, and to an extent also Richarda, tried to construct these ideas of the domestic and the observatory spaces as being completely separate spheres. George was especially reluctant to show how they were indeed highly entangled. Personal feelings, events, and family members shaped practices that went beyond any sort of physical boundaries in the setup to Greenwich, but he wasn't particularly delighted to admit this. And George still tries to maintain this very clear distinction between the spaces, which is very visible if you look at the letters of other people trying to come to visit Greenwich at the time. When a relative of a previous Astronomer Royal tried to visit Greenwich, George made it clear that the observatory needed to be protected from the influx of visitors, otherwise all of the work there would completely grind to a halt. But if she wanted to come and see Flamsteed House, this was completely different, and he'd be absolutely fine to show her around. It was protected by its private character, he states. Because gender also cannot be completely unlinked from this. In another letter of a group of women trying to visit the observatory, he makes it clear he only accepts visitors to Greenwich on astronomical or official business. And therefore, ladies, quote, are generally excluded. However, what I hope the Neptune correspondence has shown is that these artificially constructed boundaries need to be taken with a pinch of salt. You can clearly see that Neptune was just one of the instances for which there was never really a clear-cut distinction between the boundaries for some people in Greenwich. But what is important to emphasise, with my focus on archives, is that these ideas of gender, domestic spaces, and observatory spaces become reinforced in the RGO collections. Georges saw these spaces as distinct, and I don't think it's a coincidence that Richarda's replies to Cedric are not preserved in the RGO collections. The implications for this are also pretty clear. Women in domestic spaces become obscured as active participants in key moments in history of astronomy, like the Neptune controversy. It's only when we see Richarda's papers that we understand the importance of understanding this dimension of things at Greenwich. And unless we acknowledge the limitations of RGO collections and find ways to bring back other voices into this collection, we're going to end up reinforcing these kind of distinct ideas of the spaces. So to conclude, I firstly focused on Richarda's papers and their relationship to the RGO collections. We looked at how George's organisational principles extended to his family papers, but Richarda's papers were preserved for a very specific reason. Richarda was part of the observatory business, and these papers show her deep involvement, but they also necessarily point to some of the limitations of the RGO collections. Secondly, what was preserved for very specific reasons. Luckily, the kind of crossover and entanglement was very strong. Women and these domestic spaces are never really truly erasable from the RGO collections. But perhaps my presentation is a warning or encouragement to look for other limitations in these archives and what we might get to learn by putting the RGO collections in conversation with other archives. So in terms of future directions for the history of maths, maybe it's time to continue critically analysing how we've come to know what we have come to know, and inspecting our archives is a fun way to kind of start that process. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Meg, for that wonderful talk. We have time for questions, if any. Yeah, June?
Thanks, Meg, that was great. I'm afraid it's not directly connected to exactly what you were talking about, but I was just interested in what sort of educational background Richarda had, because you sort of indicated that she seemed to really understand what was going on. So did she learn that from Airy, or had she?
Well, it's great actually. Her dad tutored her and her sisters at home. That's pretty clear. And when they do marry, her dad writes a nice letter to George stating that, you know, she's very prepared for this role that she's stepping into as the wife of a scientist, and like the education has kind of trained her to be in this position. So there's not a lot about what exactly their education would have involved in home, but he definitely was involved in tutoring them in some sense at home. So a quite privileged educational background, I think.
I mean, and do you think there's any sense in which Airy kind of helped, you know?
Not George, but Richarda did take it on herself. Like, she talks about reading books and trying to improve her French through her own volition, rather than anything about George specifically stepping in at that point.
Thank you.
Isabel?
Thanks. Just to sort of, well, first of all, to add to that little question, the Devonshire family were, of course, a notable scientific family, and I can quite conceive that Chaplin was partially chosen for his equally scientific competence.
Well, he was also their tutor in classics. So yes, that is definitely. There was Cambridge things going on. Yep.
If he was educated with her. And then on to the question, you mentioned right at the beginning she was a prolific letter writer. And to what extent was she doing that, if you like, on her own account, what extent was it just fostering the whole families, but particularly George's social networking and one of those sort of important things, maintaining social status on his behalf as well as.
Yeah, well, I think these Neptune letters can also very much be read in that kind of light, because she really does spend a lot of the letters defending his actions. So I think it's a bit of both, because the letters to Margaret Herschel, they're kind of a real mix. Like, some of them, it really is just her talking about her life and everything, and raising the children and everything like that. But at the same time, I do think she was an important link in this kind of network of strengthening the Airies and the kind of observatory status in this network.
Deborah? Oh. Did you still?
I just have a small question. So you mentioned the 1851 correspondence about the prominence experiments.
Yep.
That wound up in the RGO collection.
Yep.
Do you have it? You had a nice list of why the things wound up in there, but do you have a sense if the diagrams had anything to do with it? That it was a capturing of the construction of the instrument and the images of the celestial object?
I think it's more to do with the method that she does describe, because so James Naismith and George were also trying to conduct these experiments to replicate the prominences using a different method, and like George writes after receiving these letters from Richardo to Naismith being like, oh, it's fine, Charles is doing something completely different, we can go on with our experiments, and he's not captured the right thing. So I think they're there to kind of, like, Richardo's letter, rather than her sketches, are referenced a lot in the kind of future, like the further correspondence between the other three. So I think that's kind of part of it.
Yep.
Thanks for a lovely paper. You noted, sort of by the way, that George Airy described her letters as collected. And it's not clear at the point at which he spoke whether that was collected by her, collected by him, or what the status of that is. And he's also, at another point, separating the letters from the collection, which shows the importance of cataloguing and where you store things and things like that. So it would be nice to learn a little bit about how active that process was and how much it changed, or whether there was a, in the different collections, cross-referencing, etc.
Yeah.
And the other thing that would be really nice to know is whether, in looking at the totality of her correspondence, you think there's a kind of correspondent that doesn't occur in George's letters, or in George's correspondence, whether there's a kind of correspondent that doesn't occur in her letters. Are these correspondences, intersecting realms, or are they, basically quite similar?
Yeah, it's those are both very good points. I will think about them more. It's quite funny. There's a letter between Richardo and Margaret that talks about how in their husband's correspondence you wouldn't even know that they had a family, which I think is kind of telling of sometimes a separation of what is in their content. But at the same time, yeah, there are definitely letters where both of them seem to be kind of acting on the same things and talking about the same content. So I will think more about this distinction, but the short answer is kind of both at the same time.
I'll let you write your notes.
That's fine.
Yeah, I was just, you mentioned a lot of people who Richardo was kind of writing to either on her own remit or on George's behalf. I was wondering how many women were in that network and how involved they were. Like, were they visiting were they visiting Flamsteed House? Were they visiting the observatory? And yeah, how much does that intersect?
Yeah. I mean, I am biased because like the biggest collection of her letters are the ones to Margaret Herschel, so that I know, and also Maria Mitchell, I just haven't seen those ones. So I know that she definitely was kind of fostering communities with both men and women in this network. Yeah. I need to kind of look at more contemporary accounts of when their friends come to visit, what spaces did that actually involve, because that is, clearly an important distinction for them, so it'd be nice to see how that played out in the actual occurrences of the visits.
So another small question. So do you have any evidence of her being engaging in sort of scientific social functions? I mean, obviously she can't swan into the Royal Society or the Royal Astronomical Society, whatever at that time. But some of these more informal things, Bridget's, found out things about Mary Somerville in that respect. So I just wondered whether there was anything at all comparable.
I mean, she goes to the BAS meetings, and she really likes going to the BAS meetings. Really likes going. George doesn't, but she does. But I mean, there's
So does she go? But I mean, they go together.
Yes.
Even though
yes.
So she drags him along.
Yeah. But there was a really other good paper about the importance of the domestic spaces in Greenwich in this period, because they wanted to move the observatory because they wanted to create a train line right through kind of where Greenwich was going to go, which is not great when you've got astronomical instruments there. And Scott Allen Johnson wrote a lovely piece about how important the domestic spaces were in their arguments against moving Greenwich, because the Airies did a lot of hosting, and the Airies were also in close proximity to London. Like it's still a bit of a travel to get from Greenwich to London today, yet alone in the 19th century, but there was a real emphasis on how it was an important hub for people to come, and in that context you get like a very easy way to kind of learn about Richarda is to read comments of people, again, visiting Flamsteed House and the observatory, because there's a lot of compliments to her about how she hosts very well, and she's a very good hostess, listens to people. I mean, they're very comments that were made for a certain perspective, but there's a lot of mentions of her involvement in this kind of space. And similarly, when they were at Cambridge, actually. So yes, I think to a certain extent, in a different way from Mary Somerville, obviously, but yeah.
Right, I'll use Chair's privilege again.
Ursula's got a hand up at the back.
Ursula.
Yeah, I was. You had this throwaway remark about 9 children.
Yes.
Which contributes something to the domestic space, having 9 children.
Yeah.
Was there a lot of help in the house? Was there
So yeah, it's not normally just the nuclear Airy family that are there. George's mum lived at the observatory at the time. George's sister did. Richarda's sisters did. Did. Yes, and it's funny because I always thought that 9 children was a lot, because I'm so used to hearing about how the Herschels had like 1 million children, and then I sat and thought about it. I was like, whoa, 9 children is still a lot to be kind of dealing with. Although I don't think all of them would have been in the space at one time.
Did they all survive childhood?
No, 3 of them died, Elizabeth being one, and then they had 2 boys that died in very, very close proximity. But I would still say a pretty high success rate for the whole family.
I'm just thinking more of one hears about some families where the children were dragooned into helping sort the data or helping about the place with the science.
Yeah, I know that the daughters were definitely involved in the correspondent the networks, because you get lovely brief mentions of them in expedition letters. Like in the Transit of Venus, one of the wives that is out there for someone else writes back and thanks George for the letters that his daughters had sent him. So there's these little snippets, and that's as far as I've kind of got with that. But yeah, they definitely were kind of in and around and involved in these networks too.
It was a big household.
Yeah.
Another?
I hesitate a little bit about going to this point. The person that is not received 3 times, although he was calling 3 times, also because in Oxford there was this long discussion about this after your talk.
Yes.
But I still wonder about it, because okay, so this person just called in the sense of going to the building,
Yep.
and then he was not let in.
Yep.
3 times in a row. But wasn't there at that time a habit, if like the first time it didn't work or something, to write a letter the day before, even half a day before, to announce, and then sort of, I mean, I remember from another century, like in the 1920s, when people started to have telephones, I have seen many postcards sent sort of in the beginning of an afternoon, I would like to give you a phone call tomorrow morning around 9 o'clock. And so the delivery was sufficiently quick for and so on, and the other person would be. So this apparently, I'm sorry asking such a stupid.
It's not a stupid question. This did happen. So James Challis had written a letter to introduce John Couch Adams to the Airies before he did the first visit in September. George was out of the country, hadn't received the note, completely missed him. The important thing is that the Airies did not know Adams at the time, and so he had this letter. But also, then more logistics about the afternoon visit. Adams had left a note in the morning. Richarda had allegedly seen this. That's kind of the end of that strand. And then he'd also left a note in the afternoon, which Richarda and George maintain was not delivered to them because the servant lost it. So there's more note logistics, but a note definitely was left at Greenwich because George writes a reply to Adams. So he did eventually know of this visit. So there was that kind of calling etiquette. It just failed in every sense of the whole episode.
So would Couch Adams just have like had to hang around Greenwich the whole day? Like he wouldn't have gone back into central London and
I think
come
he
back
did.
up?
I think he was in London for the day on the way back from his family holiday down that way, and then came back and I think he was told that George was out, and so he's like, I'm going to stick around for a couple hours, call again in the afternoon. I mean, the other logistic point to add is that the Airies had dinner at a very weird time, even for Victorians. Like they had dinner at 3:30 p.m. religiously, and that wasn't normal. So he wouldn't have kind of been expected them to be at dinner at that time.
I think meal times mean something different as well. Like that time. Yeah.
Probably I should know this, but what did Adams think he could attain by visiting Airy? I mean, did he want to tell him, look at this place, and you will probably find Neptune there?
Yeah, I mean, he wanted to. George knew about the work that Adams was doing. He wanted to kind of update George on the kind of status of his investigations and eventually get someone to start an observational search, which George did eventually do, just not at that point. So it was kind of an update. And Adams was also getting data from George from the observatory, so it could have been related to that.
I assume he wasn't receiving, was there just a tradition of people demanding him to look at specific places for obviously not new planets, or maybe new planets? Is it like the squaring the circle of astronomy? Like, I found a new planet, please look? Or
the letters to the Astronomer Royal written by members of the public are hilarious because there are lots of letters like that. But Alan Chapman has a very good article about how George didn't actually see looking for new planets as part of the remit of the Royal Observatory because they were very used to routine things, calculations and kind of tables and not investigative research. So he didn't really think that this was part of what he should be doing.
go speak to James South. He'll
yeah, exactly. Or don't. But yeah. I don't want to go into.
I could go on for a very long time. No, I was wondering if you found letters from Richarda and other collections.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
That's
whose collection?
Well, the James David Forbes ones are very good because she writes a lot to him. And the Herschels are just two of the examples that I can name currently.
Cool. So it's not just like they in those collections were deemed worth keeping, I guess.
Yeah, but they're personal collections as opposed to like the archives for the Observatory of Greenwich. Yeah.
Do we have any final questions from the audience?
I guess I'm curious about the the space itself. When you put up that map, it looked like there were a lot of interior spaces in there.
Yes, for their 9 children.
That
they genuinely did. They had to expand the observatory when the Airies got there because they had not too many children. They had a lot of children, so they built more rooms to kind of accommodate the house of the Astronomer Royal. Yep.
And all their sisters too.
And all their sisters and mothers, and yeah, exactly. Yep.
Cool. Well, I think we should say thank you again to Meg for